Hey guys, welcome to Gen Z Codes. This is a video tutorial for HTML. In this video, we're going to be learning about the ID attribute. If you haven't seen my videos about CSS and styling and the one about links, I would suggest that you go ahead and watch those first because I'm going to be building off of that and I'll be referring to what we learned in those videos quite often. Alright, so let's begin. The ID attribute specifies a unique ID for an HTML element. Now, the value of the ID attribute must be unique within the HTML document. The ID attribute is used to point to a specific style declaration in a style sheet. It is also used by JavaScript to access and manipulate the element with a specific ID. Now, basically, what the ID attribute is it basically specifies, it kind of gives a specific element its own identity. Almost, you can kind of think of it like that, right? It gives a specific element its own identity, and you can use that identity to change things and manipulate and access the elements with the specific ID using JavaScript, or you can use it to style that specific element using CSS or something, or you can even use it for bookmarking using the links, which we'll learn a little bit later. But first, let's start with the basics. So first, let's start off by learning how to use the ID attribute to style something, and let's learn what is then the difference between a class and ID. So if you remember from the CSS videos, we had learned about, we'd basically learned about different classes, right? Where we had a dot and then we had whatever the name of the class was, we create a class. And we had basically declared a lot of properties, kind of set like a general format, right? And in that, what we'd seen was that we can use the same class. Like, as you can see over here, I've used the same class over and over again for a bunch of headings, right? As you can see over here, the first heading that I have is Fast and Furious, and I've used the class Movies for that. Same goes here, here, and basically everywhere, right? I've used the class Movies. Right? Now, considering that using the ID, we can style it, right? We can style a particular element, right? And we can do that in the same style heading using the CSS format, where we can just write the properties and we can have like any of this, right? So what is the difference between an ID and a class? So a class name can be used by multiple HTML elements, while an ID name must only be used by one HTML element within the page. So like I mentioned, over here I can use class for like the same class for a bunch of different headings or even paragraphs if I wanted, right? But here I can only use the ID for a specific heading or a specific element, right? And that's why it gives it its own personal identity. That's what I like to think of it, right? Like that ID gives an element its own specific identity. So over here, if you can see, this is where I've used the ID, and this is the syntaxing for it. So first you say ID is equal to, and then in speech marks you can you can give it a name, right? So here I've just said my heading. Remember, there can't be any spaces in this, right? So I've just said my heading and I've clubbed those two words together. And yeah, so this is the syntax, basic syntax, right? Now, if you wanted to use CSS, if you wanted to style it using CSS, what you do over here is in the style attribute, you'd have hashtag my heading, or basically hashtag, and then whatever you've put in these speech marks, you'd have that. So here I've put hashtag my heading, and then I've basically described whatever I want it to look like using CSS. So I've said my background color should be light blue, color of the text should be medium sea green, padding should be 30 px, and the text align should be in the center, right? And here I've just said heading with ID. So that's basically one use of ID, right? It's that I can use it to style a particular element. And of course, if you want to style an element, you can also use inline CSS and inline styling. But if you want to use internal CSS by any chance, or internal styling, but you only want to use it for a specific, like one specific element, you can always just put it over here and use the ID element for that, right? And so that just makes it a lot easier sometimes. Right, so now that we've covered the style aspect of it, the second aspect that we had was HTML bookmarks with IDs and links. So HTML bookmarks actually allow readers to jump to specific parts of a web page. Now, bookmarks can be useful if your page is very long, right? So let me show you an example. Over here, what I've done is I have all of my classes and I have all of my paragraphs, right? So what this web page is going to display is it's basically going to display names of movies, and it's going to have basically small short paragraphs underneath it, just like describing what the movie is or what the series of movies is, right? So here I have Fast and Furious, Avengers, Mission Impossible, X-Men, Hunger Games, Rocky, Back to the Future, and Men in Black. Now this is going to be a pretty long web page if you think about it, and even if you open it up, and I'll show you this a bit later, it's going to be a pretty long web page. And so let's say I'm at the top of the web page, right? But I don't want to learn about Fast and Furious, or I don't want to learn about Avengers, right? I only want to know about the last one, which over here is Men in Black, which is like at the bottom of the web page, right? So I can add a bookmark right over here. So this is my bookmark, and I can give this Men in Black an ID, right? I can say your ID is MIB, right? Men in Black. So you can say your ID is MIB. And then over here, using links, I can say href is equal to hashtag MIB, and you put that in quotations. And here you can just say skip to Men in Black or whatever, right? So basically what this is going to do is it's going to create an almost like an internal link. So it's going to link this to this part of the page. So when I click on this, right, when I click on this link, it will take me to the bottom of the page where it says Men in Black, right? And even if I had, like, let's say I had something even beyond this or whatever, and like maybe I had a lot more movies or whatever, it wouldn't take me to the bottom of the page, that's to be noted. It would take me to wherever it says Men in Black, so wherever this ID is, right? So whichever, like I can even give this an ID, like I can give Back to the Future an ID, and I can put a bookmark over here that says skip to Back to the Future, and it will take me to Back to the Future exactly, right? And let me actually do that right now. I can show you exactly how. So I can say skip to Back to the Future, and here I would give it a distinct ID, right? It would be separate from MIB, so I'd say maybe Back to the Future, so let's just say BF, right? And over here I would say ID is equal to BF, right? So now the browser's going to look, so over here the browser's going to look for the same thing with the ID, right? And it's going to see that the BF is over here and the MIB is over here. So it's going to link this to the element that has the ID of MIB. It's going to link this that has the ID of BF. Right? I know it may sound a teensy bit complicated right now and might be a bit confusing, but as soon as we look at the web page, you'll hopefully understand it a bit better. Alright, so remember how I said that there's also a third use for the ID, and that is to do with JavaScript. So basically, you can use the ID attribute in JavaScript, and I'm going to talk about that just in brief. And in case you don't know JavaScript yet, I would suggest that you maybe not watch this right now because you may not understand it exactly. But once you do know JavaScript, you can come back and go through this entire thing so that you actually are able to understand it now, right? Okay, so let's talk about using the ID attribute in JavaScript. Now, the ID attribute can also be used by JavaScript to perform some task for that specific element. Now, JavaScript can access an element with a specific ID with the getElementById method. So over here you can see I've said document.getIdByElement, right? And this is the method that I've used. Right. So, as you can see, I have a button over here, right? I've created a button before I start my JavaScript. And I've said onClick display result, right? And over here, I've defined a function called display result. And what I'm saying over here is basically that get element by ID. So access this element, which is head, and then use the internal HTML, and then change the heading to, so basically print the heading as changed heading. Right? So what this entire thing is going to do, this JavaScript part, it's basically defining a function by which when you call that function, when you use it, it will basically change the text of a certain thing. And this kind of makes it almost dynamic. It's a small component, not exactly dynamic, still a bit static, but you're on the way to learning how to make a dynamic website once you learn JavaScript, basically. So yeah, that's what this is going to do, right? It's going to access this function over here. So once you click on this particular button, what it's going to do is, if this was the original heading, it's going to change it, right? It's going to change it to changed heading, right? So basically, all right, let me just go through this one last time, just in case you weren't able to comprehend that completely. So you have H1, you have ID, and its ID is head, right? Then below H1 you have a button, all right? And the button is basically, the button says change text. Now what this button is going to do is that once it is clicked, it is going to perform the function display result, right? So now over here in our JavaScript, right, in our JavaScript, we have defined a function called display result. So this is basically the same. So this is what's going to happen. This function is what's going to happen once you click on that button. Now what this function does is that it accesses the element with the ID head, which is this one, right? And it's going to use the HTML and it's going to change it to changed heading. It's going to change the content to changed heading. So if it first said heading, it's going to now say changed heading. So let's go ahead and now let's look at our entire web page, and let's look at everything that we've learned so far. Alright, so here I have my web page all completed. So let's discuss the different elements one by one. So the first one that we had was the heading element, right? H1. And we had used CSS and the ID to style that. As you can see, if you go back to the code now and if you look at it, you'll see that it's styled exactly the way we had said, right? The background color is light blue, the color of the text is medium sea green, we have the padding, which is 30px, which is evident considering that it's a rectangle now, and the text align, which is center, right? And those were the main properties that we said, well, those were the only properties, rather, that we had said, and all of them are present, and we can see that the ID and the styling basically attributes have worked on this, right? And so that's how this ID would work. If you try using this ID on a completely different element altogether, it probably wouldn't work because it's not a unique ID, right? So for each element that you want, you need to have a unique ID, and your ID will most likely only work on just one single element, and that's why it has to be unique. All right, so that was how we used our ID for styling. And the second way that we used it was for bookmarking, right? So as you can see over here, I have many different movies, and I've used CSS classes to style them, and as you can see, CSS classes can work on multiple elements, right? I have like a lot of elements that use the same class, and that's why they look the same, but that cannot be done with ID. But yeah, anyway, so I have a lot of movie names over here, and it's a pretty long web page. Now let's say I wanted to skip to Men in Black, so that's why I put, like, let's say I only want to look at Men in Black, but it's too long of a web page for me to keep scrolling, right? Which is why I put a bookmark, so I can click on the bookmark, and it takes me to Men in Black, right? And it's almost like a link, and I can just click on it, right? And same goes for Back to the Future, right? Let's say I wanted to go skip to that, and it basically just takes me here because it's at the same, they're both together almost. So yeah, it just takes me to wherever the ID is, because I've linked Back to the Future to this part. I've linked this to Back to the Future, and I've linked that to Men in Black, so it just takes me to wherever they are. And that's what a bookmark essentially does, right? It takes you to wherever that part is. It's almost like a contents page. You can actually create maybe like a contents page if you want it, like just to try this out. But it's almost like a contents page in a book. If you more so in an ebook, right? If you click on one of the chapters or something on an ebook, it usually just takes you to that chapter, and that's almost what this is doing, right? It just takes you to that particular place. Alright, so the last thing that we had done was we used JavaScript, and we learned that basically what we had discussed was that this heading over here, when we click on this button, it should change to changed heading. So let's click on this button, and there we go, it's changed to changed heading, right? And that's how you can use JavaScript to maybe do cool things like this on your web page. And this is how you can also make use of ID in JavaScript, and how you can basically use ID in so many different ways. So I hope you've understood that, and I hope you enjoyed this, because ID is a lot of fun actually, and you can do a lot of things with ID. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you really understood it. If you didn't, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. Thank you for watching. Happy coding!